I want to thank Brother Ray and those who've come from the Summit City congregation over in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where Brother Ray preaches. Good to see those who are here from other congregations as well. You know, the thrust, this theme for such a time as this from Esther chapter 4, verse 14, we're hoping that everyone understands the why behind it. In our local bulletin last week, we tried to lay that groundwork as to the emphasis behind these lessons. Last night, Brother Richard Nepal gave us a great groundwork for these series of lessons. Brother Rico kicked us off this morning. And so now Brother Phil Greer, who serves as the preacher and one of the elders of the East High Street congregation in Springfield, is going to pick it up and take that baton. Phil is a native of Parkersburg, West Virginia. He's a 1974 graduate of Harding University. He's been preaching for nearly 5 decades, 48 years with congregations in West Virginia and Ohio. I can't believe it's been this long, Phil. Phil's been at East High since 2000. It just seems like it was yesterday, but you and I both are older. Phil and his wife, Darlene, have made several mission trips to Costa Rica as well as to Scotland and Peru. Lord willing, I'll be joining Phil and Darlene and others this January heading to Costa Rica. Phil has made mission trips to Italy. He and his wife, they have 2 daughters, Amy Adrick and husband Luke, live in Galloway, Ohio. Luke is a deacon at the Fishinger congregation there in Columbus. His wife, Amy, serves as the church secretary. And Katie Gilcrease and husband, Jack, live in Scott Depot, West Virginia, where Jack Gilcrease serves as their preacher. And they have 3 grandchildren, who are, 2 of them attend Freed Hardeman and Andrew. So we are excited about Phil. I've known Phil for a long time. We've listened to Phil preach, and Phil is sound. We can trust him, a man of integrity. And so let's give our attention now to Phil as he speaks to us, a time for integrity in a day of dishonesty. Preach the word.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you for the invitation to be a part of this lectureship. This is why, I don't know, 3 or 4 years in a row now, and I appreciate the opportunity and to be a part of it every year. I think these things do an awful lot of good, and I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of it, as I said. Got a little bit of a challenge here this morning. I got to thinking, as Rico was preaching a little while ago, he said he did that on 2 cups of coffee. If he'd had that 3rd cup, I don't know if we could have stood it. But we got a bigger issue right now than that. I've had no coffee, which is fine with me because I don't like the stuff. I was telling somebody a little bit ago, I think I've had 1 cup of coffee literally in the last 25 years, and that was not by choice. I was in the middle of a Bible study with a lady in Costa Rica, and Costa Rican custom is that if you sit there, they will serve you usually coffee because it's one of the major crops that they grow there. She didn't ask if I wanted any. She just brought me a cup, and I knew if I didn't drink it, I was probably going to offend her. So I choked down drank a cup of coffee. And as we got in the car after the Bible study was over to return to the church building, I looked at my wife and my daughter were with me, and they both drink coffee. And I looked at them and I said, okay, I have no frame of reference. Was that good coffee or not? To which I was entitled, that is the sweetest coffee we ever drank. She must have loaded that stuff with sugar, which is fine. Still didn't taste good, but it was okay. So I've had no coffee. So if you fall asleep and I fall asleep, we'll know what happened. Job didn't deserve any of it. The suffering that he was enduring was beyond belief. He woke up one morning wealthy, went to bed that night flat broke. Worse, he'd gone from being the loving father of 10 children to grieving the loss of every one of them. Within one day, he'd gone from a good life and good health to total misery in just a matter of hours. He lived a life where he'd been very concerned about living a life of decency and integrity. To the point he says in Job chapter 31 and verse 6 that he was not afraid to have God even test his integrity. He said, let me be weighed in an even balance that God may know mine integrity. His integrity was the focus of his life. In Job chapter 27 and verse 5, he says, till I die, I will not remove mine integrity from me. Even when his wife challenged him to curse God, she even said, will you maintain your integrity? Just curse God and die. And a lot of times I think she gets a bum rap there. You got to remember, she just lost everything she owned, including all 10 of her children as well. The woman was in pain. She was in emotional agony and probably was saying some things maybe that she didn't even, so far as we know, maybe she didn't even really believe. But Job knew that no matter what the circumstances of life were going to be, he was not going to sacrifice his integrity to that. He was going to stand for what he knew to be right, regardless of whatever it is happened to him in this world. When you stop and think about that, for that matter, he'd reached a point in his life where his integrity was about all he had left, and he wasn't going to surrender that. And so you want to look at him and say, Job, what is integrity? And why is it so important to you? Brethren, I'm convinced right now that America definitely, desperately needs to answer the question, what is integrity and why does it matter? I got a feeling if you put integrity in a spelling bee, the first person to get the word might be set down. I wonder if we can spell it, let alone understand it anymore. It definitely seems to be a missing ingredient in the society in which we live. Americans have reached a point where we expect to be lied to. We expect to be cheated, often because we lie and cheat ourselves. It's just almost become a way of life. No longer is a man's word his bond. You know, there was a day in which you could settle a deal on a handshake. Now you need 12 lawyers and 6 notary publics to guarantee that somebody won't find a loophole to get out of something they just promised to do. What happened to the days when you could go off and leave your house unlocked, leave your car unlocked? What happened to the day? I think it's reached a sad situation when now we live in a society where we have to lock our cars in the church parking lot before we can go into services. Where we literally, after services start, we've got a notice on our door at home. After services start, 2 of our 3 outside exits will be locked. Please use the door on the west side if you come in late. Isn't it sad we've reached that point? What happened to the days as they used to be? In the 1940s, 20% of American college students admitted they cheated in high school. Recent surveys show that number have gone from 20% to somewhere between 75 and 90% now admit that they cheated while they were in high school. 80% of Americans admit to have shoplifted at least once, and 10% say they do it on a regular basis. 96% of Americans admit to lying on occasion. 75% of Americans admit to stealing at least once from their employers. I read a statement made a few years ago by an owner of a large chain of grocery stores. He had just tried to open a new store in a particular location, and they had gone to interviewing potential employees. He said, this particular store employs 280 people. We interviewed and gave pre-employment tests to over 2,000 applicants. He said, we were very nervous up until about 2 weeks prior to opening because we had barely hired the 200 of the 280 people we needed. The problem was that about 1,800 of those we interviewed, now listen to this, that 1,800 of those we interviewed openly admitted they were stealing from their employer or had stolen in the last 6 months. And he said the really scary thing was these people didn't see anything wrong with what they were doing. Everybody does it, right? A lady received a phone call one day from little Johnny's school teacher. She said, we've got a problem. Johnny has been caught stealing pencils from other students. And the mother was horrified. She said, I'll talk to him. I don't know where he learned to do that. Besides, he doesn't need to do it. I bring him every pencil he needs home from work. People, even Christians, some who would never ever think of robbing a bank or robbing a convenience store, will fudge on their income taxes or exaggerate an insurance claim or call in sick for work when they're not, or say, well, tell them I'm not home when the phone rings if it's somebody they don't want to talk to, or make a copy of a DVD in spite of the FBI warning at the very beginning of that this is illegal and it's a violation of the law. Well, I'm not going to sell it. Read the FBI warning. It says even without financial compensation. Brethren, it's illegal. It's stealing. It's dishonest. What is the Christian's role in a day of dishonesty? How do we function as people of integrity in a world that doesn't want to? I want you to turn with me to the 15th Psalm. There we base our study for the next hour. Psalm number 15. In this particular psalm, David starts out by asking a question. He asks the same question twice in two different ways, but it's the same question. He asks, Lord, who may abide in your tabernacle? Who may dwell in your holy hill? And then he spends the next 4 verses answering that question. Now, you take that question he asks in verse 1, and basically he's saying this: who's going to heaven? Who's going to go to heaven? And then the next 4 verses he answers that for us. He says, he who walks uprightly and works righteousness and speaks the truth in his heart. He who does not backbite with his tongue, nor does evil to his neighbor, nor does he take up a reproach against his friend, in whose eyes a vile person is despised, but he honors those who fear the Lord. He who swears to his own hurt and does not change. He who does not put out his money at usury, nor does he take a bribe against the innocent. He who does these things shall never be moved. First of all, David would have us understand that those who are going to go to heaven are people of integrity, those people who are honest with God. And brethren, that's where it starts. We will never be honest with each other until we're honest with God. He says those who walk uprightly and those who work righteousness. Uprightly in the original is a word that means innocent or blameless. Righteousness meaning that which is right. It's a person who walks an innocent, blameless life doing that which is right and focuses on making that his focus in life. It's a person who makes a habit of righteous living. Listen to the words of John in 1 John chapter 3, beginning of verse 6, where John says, whoever abides in him does not sin. He who practices righteousness is righteous just as he is righteous. Whoever has been born of God does not sin, for his seed remains in him, and he cannot sin because he has been born of God. Now, there's a lot in that passage. It sounds confusing, and a lot of that's a subject for another lesson. But what I think we can get out of that passage connection with this lesson is simply this. The main thrust is that one following God does not make an habitual practice of sin. He makes an habitual practice of righteousness. It is a man in whom integrity, it is a woman in whom honesty is a daily habit. I'm convinced there are some people, and I bet you know some too, who honestly cannot lie. It is just foreign to who they are. They are so committed to pleasing God and so committed to the concept of honesty and integrity that if someone said, I heard them tell a lie, you'd never believe it because you know them too well. That ought to be characteristic of every child of God. You see, the person who is blameless is one who does what's right. He doesn't operate into gray areas. There are some things in this world that are obviously dishonest. But what about those questionable areas? Those things where we're just not exactly sure which way to go on this thing. A young boy walked in the kitchen one day. Mom was fixing supper. He said, he was getting ready to go out for the evening. He said, Mom, is this shirt dirty? And without even turning around, she said, yeah. He said, Mom, you didn't even look. She says, if it's doubtful, it's dirty. The Christian with a person of integrity operates on that basis when it comes to honesty. If there's any doubt about it, it's dirty. And we've got to try to learn to live above that kind of thing. If there's any question whatsoever about its honesty, then don't do it. The Christian lives by what he knows is honest, not what might be honest. And then David says he's the one who speaks truth in his heart. Oh boy, that's where it begins. Integrity begins in the heart. As a man thinketh in his heart, as Rico reminded us, so is he. If a man thinks honesty in his heart, honesty is what's going to be portrayed in his life. But sometimes it's in the heart that we find it the hardest to be honest. Sometimes it's more difficult to be honest with ourselves than it is with anybody else. We can deceive ourselves into believing just about anything, but as Acts chapter 1 verse 24 says, when we're dealing with God, we're dealing with one who knows the hearts of all. He knows whether the honesty and integrity is in our heart or not. Brethren, we're talking here about spiritual dishonesty. Job said, Job 31 verse 33, that he had not covered his transgression as had Adam. You know, Adam tried to hide his sin from God. He didn't get away with it. And we won't get away with hiding our sins from God either. We may fool ourselves, we may fool those around us. But unfortunately, Adam was not the last one to try to do that. Men throughout ages have been dishonest with God about sin. They've denied it, they've hid it, they've ignored it, they've blamed others for it. Anything but be honest enough to confess it and admit that they themselves are responsible. Do you know the phrase, I have sinned? That little three-word phrase, I have sinned, is only found 3 times in the New Testament. 3 times. One of the hardest things for us as human beings to do seems to be to look God and say, I have sinned, and period. Because most of the time we want to put a comma because the next word is but. I have sinned, but Lord, let me explain what happened now. Yes, Lord, I know that wasn't the most honest thing to do, but let me tell you what. Lord, I know that probably was a little bit of a lie, but let me tell you. Before I can be honest with anyone else, I got to be honest with God. I got to be honest with myself. Then I can be honest with other people. Which brings us to verse 3 of Psalm number 15, where David tells us that we're talking about those people, those who are going to go to heaven, are going to dwell in God's tabernacle, his holy hill, those who are honest with other people. Honest, he says in verse 3, about the way they talk about others. He who does not backbite with his tongue, nor does evil to his neighbor, nor does he take up a reproach against his friend. Not backbite with his tongue. He doesn't run around as a talebearer, talking behind people's backs, spreading gossip, spreading rumors. Now, wait a minute, Phil. I thought you said this was a lesson on integrity, not gossip. How much of gossip is a lie? How much of gossip is a flat-out lie? All you have to do is say, well, now I heard, and immediately you're believed. Far too many times. At least it's enough to get the story repeated. It's all that is necessary to get some people to do evil to his neighbor or to take up reproach against a friend. 2 ladies talking over the back fence in the yard one day. They'd been talking for a while, and one of them looked at the other one and says, well, probably ought to go back in the house and get to work. Says, but besides, I'd like to tell you more about that, but I've already told you more than I know. Isn't that how gossip gets spread? Wouldn't you just like for one time to see a campaign ad for a politician in which they were honest and fair in assessing the other person's view? Wouldn't you like just one time to hear us in a religious discussion be honest about what the other person teaches? Brethren, if I believe some of the stuff that I've been told I believe through the years, I wouldn't have anything to do with me either. But we need to be careful when we talk about what other people believe, that we are honest about what they believe and not accuse them of believing things they don't believe or putting a twist on it so they come out saying something they never said. It's a matter of integrity. The Christian is honest. When he promises not to tell something, he doesn't tell it. When he's told something in confidence and he says he'll keep it confidential, he tells no one, not even, quote, well, I just told one person, but they promised me they wouldn't tell. You promised you wouldn't tell either. What's the old Spanish proverb? If three men can keep a secret, if two of them are dead. There's some truth to that, isn't there? But more than that, he goes, we need to understand that being honest with other people involves being honest in our business dealings with each other. Or as David writes in this passage, he who swears to his own hurt and does not change, verse 4. Swears to his own hurt and does not change. He learns after he's given his word that it's going to cost him to keep that word, but what does he do? He keeps his word anyway, even though it's going to be detrimental to his own cause. He stands behind his word, even when it is costly to do so. His word is his bond, even if it's painful to keep that promise. Even if he later wishes he had never made the promise, that doesn't change a thing. Oh, how we need our society to learn to keep this one. To quit looking for loopholes, to get out of promises that we've made. Pay our bills on time and in full, or make arrangements with the creditor to do it otherwise. Psalm 37, verse 21. David says, the wicked borrows and does not repay. The wicked. That's strong language. But the wicked borrows and does not repay. We're talking here about honesty at its most basic level. It's what Jesus was talking about in Matthew chapter 5 as he begins in verse 33, in what we call the Sermon on the Mount. When he says, again, you have heard it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. But I say to you, he says, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black, but let your yes be yes and your no, no, for whatsoever is more than these is from the evil one. Now let's understand something here. First of all, let's understand something here Jesus is not saying. In the context of Matthew chapter 5 in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is not talking one whit about what we do in a courtroom. This has nothing to do with swearing to tell the truth, so help me God, in a courtroom. It's not prohibiting placing yourself under oath to tell the truth in a legal situation. Did not Jesus, when placed under oath, testify? Did not Paul more than once say, God is my witness? That's not what's being discussed here. He's talking here about those day-to-day conversations that we have where we try to impress upon people that we're telling the truth, and they ought to listen to us by constantly saying, I swear, I swear, I swear. Brethren, what Jesus is saying here is we ought to be so known for our honesty and our integrity that we don't have to tell people we're swearing to tell the truth. They know we're telling the truth. Yet let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything more than that, he says, is of sin. You know, Jesus was dealing with a group of people who had so twisted the idea of oaths that it became extremely difficult to know when they were serious or not. He says, you shall perform your oath to the Lord. Sure you should. But he said, I tell you right now, you don't swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne. There were those in Jesus' day who were saying, well, if you swore by the temple, you didn't have to keep that oath. But if you swore by the gold of the temple, you had to keep that oath. If you swore by the altar of God, you didn't have to keep that oath. But if you swore by the gift offered on the altar, that one you were bound to keep. In other words, we would talk about swearing with your fingers crossed. And they had set up a situation where in the middle of a conversation, if someone made you a promise, you had to run real quick through your memory. Now, wait a minute, did he swear by the temple or the gold? I got to know so I know whether I can believe what he's going to do or not. Jesus is saying the Christian doesn't operate that way. Our yes means yes, our no means no, because we realize anything beyond that comes from where? Society. What everybody expects. No, it comes from Satan, the wicked one. Jesus is saying his followers are to be known to be so honest that you don't need to swear. In a day like in which we live now, the Christian doesn't need 12 lawyers and 6 notary publics to bind his word. We ought to still be able to settle a deal on a handshake and be believed. Teaching a class at home yesterday morning, and I made this point. Didn't think about it until just this morning. Had anything to do with what we're talking about today. Imagine, if you will, picture, if you will, God's moral standard up here. In our case of our lesson today, we'll talk about his standard of integrity and honesty. It's up here. The world, has it not, started going down here, getting lower and lower and lower. The problem is, far too many Christians think as long as I don't go as far down as the world, I'm doing okay. I'm still better than everybody else. At least I don't lie and cheat as much as everybody else does. The Christian stays up here and let the world go down here, and we are as honest as we ever were, and we don't just trail the world. We set the standard. I had a friend years ago, lived in another state. He told me they were having a rather interesting governor's election that year. One of the incumbent was running for office, and his answer was, "Yes, I lied to you, but not as much as my opponent did." And I don't mean to be picking on politicians, because we all have heard it from every walk of life, have we not? In verse 5 of our text, David says, when he talks about who's going to live in heaven, he says it is he who does not put out his money at usury, nor does he take a bribe against the innocent. Does not put out his money at usury. Now that's a reference back to Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 19 and 20, where the Jews were forbidden by the law of Moses to charge interest to a fellow Jew. If they loaned money to a fellow Jew, it had to be interest-free. Now, they could loan it to a Gentile and charge interest on that. But to a fellow Jew, they were forbidden by law to charge interest. They were also forbidden to take a bribe against the innocent. In other words, their business dealings under the law of Moses were to be so completely honest and above board in every respect, and to be done out of respect for the person with whom you are dealing. You treat them in an honest way. We would be talking about a businessman who's completely fair, one who is not looking to gain at a customer's expense. He provides the product or the service that he promised and was paid for, and does not have to be reminded and doesn't have to be taken to court to get him to do it. I heard a story one time, a woman went into a butcher shop. She wanted to buy a chicken for supper. Getting toward the end of the day, and the butcher was about out of product. So she said she wanted a chicken of a certain, a whole chicken for supper. So he picked one out and laid it up on the scale, and she said, "Well, it's a little bit small. Have you got a bigger one?" He said, "Well, let me see what I can find." And he put the chicken back under the counter, and but it was the last one he had. So he put that same chicken back up on the scale, and this time he put his thumb on the scale. And it weighed up more. She said, "That's great, I'll take both." We're talking about a situation here where the businessman or businesswoman is completely honest with the customer. But brethren, the customer's got to be completely honest with the merchant as well. It's a two-way street. It means that you return the change if they give you too much. And I'll tell you what, you go back and say, "You gave me too much change," and you'll see a shocked look on the face of the person most of the time. But the Christian does it. You don't shoplift. Even if you figure that this store's a bunch of crooks that's charging way too much for the product anyway. And they may be. And they may be overcharging, and it may be price gouging, but that's not your problem. You don't shoplift, even if it's something you really need. You don't steal it. And contrary to what a lot of people believe, shoplifting is stealing, pure and simple. And if you want to know why our prices are so high, that's one part of it. That's one thing behind it. Several years ago, I heard a young lady, and she honestly was bragging about this. She had an event coming up that she wanted to go to, and she needed a new dress. So she went down to a local clothing store, and she bought a dress. She took it home, and she wore it to that event, and then she returned it to the store as though she had never worn it. That's dishonest. That's cheating the employer. The Christians don't do that. We are absolutely honest in our business dealings with each other. That means if you got something you're selling on eBay or wherever you choose to sell it, you're completely honest with it. You tell the whole story about what you're selling. The Christian doesn't buy into the idea of caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. The Christian doesn't assume it's the buyer's responsibility to find out what's wrong with the product. If I'm selling something and I know it's defective in some way and it's going to need a repair, I tell you about it. That's the honest thing to do. It's the seller's responsibility to tell the whole story, even if it means you'll lose money, even if it means you'll lose the sale. Your integrity is not for sale. I'm kind of thinking of a statement Jesus made. I'll bet you've heard it. When he said, whatsoever you do, want men to do to you, do also to them. Didn't I read that in a book somewhere? Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12. I'm going to be as honest with you as I want you to be with me. And if I know I've got something that I'm selling, but I know it's got a problem, I'm going to tell you about it. Because I would want you to tell me if the situation were reversed. Money doesn't sway complete honesty. We do the honest thing even if it costs money. We do the honest thing even if the other person isn't being honest. We don't cheat them even if we know they're trying to cheat us. Because one very simple thing you can count on is that dishonesty will come back to haunt you. You'll pay for it somewhere. Solomon wrote Proverbs 20 and verse 17, bread gained by deceit is sweet to a man, but afterward his mouth will be filled with gravel. It'll bite you. If not in this world, when you stand before God. In Romans 12 and verse 17, the Apostle Paul writes, have regard for good things in the sight of all men. Now that's the New King James. King James Version says, provide things honest in the sight of all men. The word provide in that passage is from a word in the original language that means to think ahead. Brethren, we think ahead, we plan ahead to be honest. We don't do this on the spur of the moment, finding ourselves in a tough situation, all of a sudden trying to decide, what am I going to do? No, we've already made that decision. The day you became a Christian, you decided you would be honest in every situation. And now you plan ahead that if this situation arises, I'm going to do the honest thing. Now, when Paul says good things in the New King James, he says honest things in the King James. He uses a word that means honorable. Good things. Honest things, honorable things, that you are honorable in the way that you deal with other people. In all things, the Christian is known for being completely honest, completely honorable. In Ephesians chapter 4, the Apostle Paul gets just about as plain on this as you can be. Ephesians 4:25, he says, therefore, putting away lying, each one speak truth with his neighbor. Don't lie. Now, how do you get any plainer than that? In verse 28 of Ephesians 4, he says, let him who stole steal no longer. Stop it. Stop stealing. Stop lying. Because you are living a life that is to be characterized by righteousness and true holiness. And if you read the whole context in that passage, you come down to verse 30 of Ephesians 4, and he says to violate these things is to grieve the Holy Spirit of God. And Christians don't want to do that. Integrity. Our English word integrity actually comes from a Latin word, integer. Now, I'm no mathematician. I've got a daughter who is. I'm not. But I do know this much. An integer is a whole. And the word integer in Latin means whole or complete. And the idea then when we talk about integrity is that the Christian is wholly and completely honest. Brethren, there is no such thing as being a little bit dishonest. Honesty doesn't come on a 10-point sliding scale. You are either honest or you're dishonest. You're either truthful or you're untruthful. And if you're a little dishonest in even a little things, then you're dishonest. And you will destroy your influence as a Christian very, very quickly. It is extremely difficult to win someone to Christ who has been lied to or cheated by another Christian. Even the dishonest know a Christian ought to be honest. Someone says, but everybody does it. Not the Christian, not the child of God. Brethren, as Christians, we do not determine our behavior by what non-Christians do. In a time such as this, the Christian has no alternative but to be completely honest. The more dishonest the world becomes, and it is, the harder it can be for us, but that's no excuse for us to mimic them. The world does not need any more examples of how to lie and steal and cheat one another. They got that one pretty well figured out. They need an example of how to live without doing that. And they need it to be shown that you can live without doing that. David finishes his psalm in verse 5 by saying, he who does these things shall never be moved. We won't be moved because we'll be dwelling in God's holy hill. In a day of dishonesty, we must demonstrate integrity to a world that has a dying concept of what it is and doesn't really seem to even want to know. But we answer to God, not to them. He who does these things shall never be moved.